Needs to be remembered, NATO is the most powerful military alliance in the history of the planet Earth. And Putin certainly knows that.
Now, peace talks in Riyadh, of course, aimed at ending the war in Ukraine, took place today. It was about 4.5 hours of discussion and a working lunch, I understand. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke after the meeting to deny that he'd sidelined European leaders and Ukraine, who weren't, of course, invited to the talks today. Well, at the same time and elsewhere, we've heard that Israel is beginning negotiations for the second stage of a ceasefire this week. It comes after Hamas confirmed they will be returning 4 dead bodies of hostages on Thursday, including, we understand, the bodies of Shiri Bibas and her 2 infant sons, as well as 6 living captives on Saturday, more than the planned 3. Let's speak now to Tom Warrick, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, who spent a decade working at the US Department of State and is also an expert on European security issues. We'll cover a good evening, Tom, by the way. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Let's talk about those discussions today. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State for the US, says he's not sidelining the Europeans and Ukraine, but they have been iced out so far. They want to be included, and yet their voices are being ignored.
Well, and what Donald Trump is trying to project is this idea that he is the best person able to do a deal with Vladimir Putin. However, at the even threshold question, there are a lot of other governments, and indeed many in the United States, who wonder whether a deal with Vladimir Putin is either going to work or be valid or will be lived up to or not by Putin himself. Given that previous deals, for example, not to attack Ukraine, have obviously not been adhered to. So it's quite a bit of controversy associated with President Trump's idea that his relationship with Putin will somehow lead to better relations and more security.
Yeah, look, let's talk about what we may have heard today, and actually something I'm interested to muse over is what Russia really wants out of these talks with the United States. We know that the United States, Donald Trump, actively seeking a peace deal. That is, partly because they feel that enough money has been spent. They want to end the war. President Trump wants to be seen as being a peacemaker. He wants his hand in history on this. But what does Russia want to get out of these talks?
By all account, what Vladimir Putin wants was to rebuild the Russian Empire. And in his way of thinking, having Ukraine under Moscow's rule is an essential part of a Russian imperial identity. To him, the sort of larger Slavic myth that underlies Russia's founding. I mean, every country has national myths. Russia is no exception. But it requires unity between the traditional Russian people and the people of Kievan Rus, the area around what is now called Ukraine. And so to him, in order to be a proper world power, Russia needs to absorb Ukraine. The Ukrainian people, it goes almost without saying, have a very different view. They have a strong sense of national identity. They have fought for their independence. They've died for their independence. And even people who, for whom Russian is their first language in Ukraine, actually would rather be Ukrainian than be Russian. They also want Ukraine to anchor itself in the West with Europe and see themselves as a major European power, not as a subordinate vassal to the Kremlin.
Let's just reflect on the comments of Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Secretary, today. Obviously, he had these talks with a delegation from the US. He said the expansion of NATO is a direct threat to Russia. He said it was unacceptable for peacekeeping forces, whether from NATO or under the flag of the EU, to enter Ukraine. And Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, within the last day or so, has stepped up and said the UK, he was the first Western leader to do this, the UK will step up and provide peacekeeping troops if that is one of the conditions of a peace deal. But this is a this is a red line from Russia so far. Where do you think this will go?
Actually, no, it isn't. This is all a negotiation. There's a lot of bluff and bluster going on. There was bluff and bluster behind the nuclear threats that Russia was going to use nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory. And I think what we're seeing here is the same kind of bluff and bluster once again. In particular, what Lavrov and Putin are trying to do is to make it possible for Donald Trump not to commit U.S. troops, in large part because the way NATO is structured, American logistical intelligence, air power, and ground troops are the best in the entire arsenal. It needs to be remembered, NATO is the most powerful military alliance in the history of the planet Earth. And Putin certainly knows that. There is no way that the current Russian military would be able to last very long against a NATO military, especially if Russia tried to attack. And so what Russia wants to do is to make any force that gets deployed in defense of Ukraine as weak as possible. And so excluding the United States is an essential part of that strategy. The thing to watch is whether they soften around the idea of no NATO troops or no troops from NATO countries, because it is quite possible that Britain, France, other countries could choose to contribute troops to a buffer force that would act as a tripwire to try to prevent Russia from sending troops back into Ukraine in several years. But there's a whole history here, including the problems with those kinds of tripwire forces. And so this is really all still very much at the early stage of negotiation.
Tom Warrick, you're also an experienced voice on the Middle East. You served in the US Department of State on the Middle East and on international justice issues as well. We note that phase 2 of the ceasefire deal will, talks about it certainly. Will begin this week later than planned. It was meant to happen in early February. The second phase of the deal, of course, is all about securing the release of the remaining 64 hostages. We know that there will be 6 hostages released on Saturday, along with the bodies of 4 hostages on Thursday of this week. But this second stage is where it gets really tricky, isn't it? And all of this, of course, against the backdrop of Donald Trump, since this deal was negotiated, of Donald Trump saying that he wants the US to control Gaza. So give me your overview, really, on these on this phase 2 of the deal.
Okay, so the people of Gaza are going nowhere. The United States will never own Gaza. Those things are obvious, blindingly obvious to everyone. You're absolutely right, though, that phase 2 is really all about the question of who governs Gaza in the future. Unless there is an agreement on that question, then phase 2 will never be finished. Once there is a deal on that question, a workable deal, then it's possible to see us move through the end of phase 2 and into phase 3, which is reconstruction. And let me note something has really changed since the outset of the war. One of the things I do here at the Atlantic Council is appear a lot on Arabic television stations talking about Middle East issues. In November and December of 2023, every single Palestinian interlocutor assumed Hamas would be governing Gaza indefinitely. Today, that has completely changed. There is increasing recognition that Hamas is going to have to recede from power and something else is going to have to be put in its place. And so now the question is, what does that something else look like? And today we notice for the first time, Egypt is reportedly putting together a serious plan that could be workable, that would be neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority, but rather local Palestinians backed up by a security force. And although the details are still
they're still scant,
unclear,
aren't we? But we are due to, or they are due to present that to the United States. So we hear February the 24th was the date that we had, but we'll keep a close eye on it because, of course, any plans need to be looked at